parents kicked me out because I refused to give my sister the farm my grandpa left me. I was around 8 when it started to hit me that my parents weren't exactly putting me front and center. It felt like I was living in some ordinary suburban bubble. Wide streets, neat lawns, the occasional lemonade stand. But something was off in our house. Neighbors would chat about how their kids brought home decent grades or joined a soccer league, and I'd sit there wondering why my own family seemed to forget I existed half the time. Whenever I mustered the courage to ask for help, maybe a ride to a school event or a small boost with homework, I'd hear that I should figure out myself because I was big enough. Meanwhile, my sister, only 2 years younger, was treated like she was a star of a hit sitcom. If her phone battery dropped to 10%, the entire household scrambled for a charger. If I needed help fixing my bike, I was told to save up for a repair shop. Early on, I tried to convince myself that this was just how life worked, that maybe older kids always had to be more independent, or maybe my parents had some secret plan for me to toughen up. As time passed, though, it became clear that my sister was getting a VIP pass I never received. She had new clothes for every big dance at school, fancy weekend outings, and endless social media posts of her living the good life. My parents would pose with her in front of scenic overlooks, all wearing brand new matching jackets. And I'd be left with secondhand shirts and a gentle reminder not to whine about it. By my early teens, I found part-time work to buy basic things that other kids' parents usually provided. At first, I handled local chores like mowing lawns in the neighborhood. I got used to the smell of fresh-cut grass clinging to my sneakers. Later, I started stocking shelves at the supermarket for extra money. My father would sometimes suggest I try delivering pizzas, though he never offered to drive me there or anything. My mother would merely nod and say that it was good for me to learn responsibility. On the flip side, I saw them drop cash on my sister's fancy dance classes, plus that new smartphone she desperately needed. I told myself that I was learning valuable life lessons, but it felt more like I was being shown the door. The only genuine ally I had was my grandpa, who lived a couple hours away on a small farm that smelled like hay and a dash of tractor oil. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just a modest house, a lean-to shed, and a few fenced-in acres. He had a couple of cows, a handful of chickens, and a dog that always limped a little but never missed a chance to bark at passing cars. Nobody in my immediate family besides me ever bothered visiting. My sister complained the place smelled weird, and my parents claimed they were too busy, though I suspected it was because my grandpa openly disapproved of how they treated me. I still remember summer afternoons riding in my grandpa's old pickup truck. It rattled like a tin can at every bump, and we'd pass by endless cornfields under a blazing sun. I was usually covered in dirt from helping him fix fences or feed the animals, but there was a sense of peace in those moments. He used to mention, in his own subtle way, that I was clever and determined, and that I could build a decent future if I kept my head on straight. I'd shrug like I didn't care, but deep down, that encouragement made me feel like I wasn't totally invisible. Back home, things never changed. My sister would show off new clothes or a fresh manicure that my mother happily paid for. My father kept promising to help her practice for her driving test the minute she turned 16. It all seemed so predictable. Any conversation about my future involved them reminding me that if I really wanted to succeed, I should just work harder. Sometimes it felt like living in a weird reality show where my sister was a star, and I was just a side character who occasionally walked onto the set to mop the floor. By the time I hit 18, the topic of college came up. My guidance counselor at school mentioned that with decent grades and some financial support, I could apply to a few places out of state or maybe start a community college. I decided to float the idea to my parents, hoping they'd at least point me in the right direction. I was expecting something along the lines of partial help or an offer to co-sign a loan. Instead, they said they had no funds to spare and that I should keep working if I was serious about higher education. There was an offhand remark about how they doubted I had what it took, though they never said it flat out. It just lingered in the air like a bad smell. A week after that conversation, a brand new Ford pulled up in our driveway, red paint shining like a candy wrapper. It was for my sister, who had just turned 16. She paraded around the neighborhood, snapping pictures for her social media, captioning them with phrases about independence and freedom. Nobody thought to ask how I felt seeing them invest in her big time, while telling me they had nothing left for my education. It was a hollow confirmation of everything I'd suspected my entire life, like I'd stumbled into a real-life reminder that I was apparently not even a blip on their radar. That blow left me feeling more alone than ever. For a while, I tried to laugh it off, telling myself jokes about how at least I could save on gas since I wasn't going anywhere. I joked around that maybe my sister needed that car more than me, because carrying that silver spoon around must be exhausting. Deep down, though, the humor felt like a flimsy shield, and it cracked a little more each day. I kept thinking about how much simpler things were at my grandpa's farm, where all I needed was a pair of work gloves and some patience to feel useful. Not long after the car incident, I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone when I heard my mother in the living room, sounding startled. I wandered in and found her holding a letter from a hospital near my grandpa's farm. The news made the whole house grow silent. My grandpa had passed away, quietly and unexpectedly. He was the one person who believed in my potential, even when I wasn't entirely sure I had any. Hearing that he was gone felt like someone had yanked the rug out from under me. I struggled to process the gravity of it. It was as if a protective barrier had vanished, and I was standing alone with nothing to catch me if I stumbled. I stared at the letter, feeling my stomach twist in knots, and realized that the last piece of real support in my life was gone. I didn't know how I was going to make it through the next phase without him in my corner. All I knew was that my future had just taken an unexpected turn, and I was on my own in a family that never really seemed to notice me in the first place. I spent the first couple of days after losing my grandpa in a numb haze, trying to accept that I'd never again see him strolling around the farm with that contented look on his face. It was like waking up and realizing the one person who genuinely believed in you was no longer around say, "You got this." The funeral itself felt more like a surreal family reunion than a respectful send-off. My parents, sister, and a couple distant relatives showed up, along with some of Grandpa's old friends who brought so many casserole dishes, you'd think they were feeding an entire stadium. That small-town American tradition for you. When in doubt, bring food. I tried mingle, but the chatter about my sister's big ambitions and everyone's small talk about the weather made me feel out of place. People said the usual polite things they say at funerals, but whenever I looked around, I noticed I was the only one tearing up or feeling like the walls were slowly closing in. My sister spent half the service scrolling on her phone, probably updating her social media with a filtered shot of her outfit or complaining about how bored she was. After the service, everyone made their way to Grandpa's farm. I wandered around the property like I was in a fog, searching for pieces of him in every rickety fence post, every cow path, every squeaky barn door. The place was way more than just some old farmland to me. It was the embodiment of my grandfather's spirit, the sweat equity he'd put into every beam and nail. The barn had once bright red paint, now faded to a muted brick color, and the fences looked like they were one strong gust away from toppling over. It mirrored the unsteady feeling inside my own chest. Eventually, everyone crammed into Grandpa's modest living room, which smelled like hay, fresh bread, and a faint hint of lemon disinfectant. The old recliner in the corner seemed out of place without my grandpa in it, sipping his evening coffee. The crowd settled, and in walked an attorney who looked straight out of a TV legal drama. Briefcase, polished shoes, and a serious expression. He announced that he was there to read Grandpa's will, and I felt all eyes pivot in my direction. My parents exchanged this look that screamed they were anticipating a major payout, like maybe Grandpa had stashed a fortune away under the barn. My sister peeled her gaze from her phone, feigning polite interest at the prospect of something that might finance her big plans. I could almost see the dollar signs in their eyes, as though they already had big ideas for how to spend what Grandpa left behind. The tension in the room got thick enough to slice with a butter knife when the attorney revealed that Grandpa had left the farm to me, plus a small sum that barely covered the property's debts. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I wasn't expecting a windfall, and I didn't expect one, but hearing that he'd entrusted his beloved farm to me was like getting a final nod of approval from the only person who ever saw my potential. Meanwhile, my parents' faces went blank, as if they couldn't fathom that the spotlight might be on me for once. My dad cleared his throat and immediately insisted that the farm had to be sold, citing the urgent need to fund my sister's upcoming business school. He rattled off figures and tuition costs like he'd been memorizing them for months, trying to make his argument sound like a no-brainer. My mom nodded, mentioning that if there was anything left after expenses, I might see a bit of it. I stood there, thinking how typical it was for them to assume that everything, even Grandpa's final wishes, should revolve around my sister. Then my sister chimed in. She wrinkled her nose like she just smelled something awful, calling the farm gross and basically worthless. It was a strange moment of clarity for me. I recalled all those summers helping Grandpa with the cows, feeling more at home than I ever did in the suburbs. The notion that they'd sell this piece of them off for a quick payday left a sour taste in my mouth. It was as if they were erasing the only place where I truly felt seen and respected. I exhaled and said I wasn't selling. My dad's jaw practically unhinged, and he began lecturing me about how I was turning my back on a huge financial opportunity. My sister hopped on that train, claiming I'd never amount to anything anyway, so I might as well enjoy living among the livestock. I remember thinking the cows seemed to have a more civilized approach to life than my own family did in that moment. Suddenly, all the pent-up tension from my childhood boiled over, like a pot left on the stove too long. My dad declared that if I insisted on holding on to farm, I might as well stay there permanently because he had no place for me back home. Oddly enough, I felt calmer than ever when he said it. If he was trying to scare me, it didn't work. I'd been living in the shadows of their indifference for so long that a clean break felt almost refreshing. They left in a huff, tossing around threats about cutting me off from any financial help. I watched their car speed away, gravel crunching under the tires, and found myself stuck between a wave of panic and a sense of relief. It was like I'd just leapt off a cliff without checking if there was water below, but at least it was my decision. The farm was quiet except for the rustle of a light breeze through the nearby trees and the occasional lowing of the cows in the distance. The next couple of days were a blur of pacing around, trying to figure out how to feed the animals on my own, and rummaging through Grandpa's old tools in the barn. The smell of dirt, hay, and old leather was oddly soothing. Every corner of that barn reminded me of Grandpa's gentle but firm instruction, like the time he taught me how to hold a hammer correctly or how to gently guide a calf without spooking it. Then came the delivery driver with a bunch of beat-up boxes that had my name scrawled across them. The poor guy looked baffled as he handed them over. Turned out my parents had packed all my belongings, clothes, books, an old basketball trophy, even some random knickknacks, and shipped them off with zero care. Taped to the top was a note basically saying, "Enjoy your new life," dripping with sarcasm. I stood there on the porch, reading that note while balancing a half-torn box, and felt a wave of complicated emotions. I was angry at how they'd always treated me as an afterthought, but I also felt oddly liberated. This was their final message telling me I was on my own, and part of me was almost grateful. At least now, there'd be no illusions about their support. No more waiting for scraps of attention or half-hearted pats on the back. I brought the boxes in, sorting through my mismatched belongings, and found an old photo of me and Grandpa standing by the barn, me sporting a crooked grin while holding a bale of hay. The memory flooded back. The smell of sun-warmed wood, and the pride in Grandpa's eyes whenever I tried my best to help. I realized that was a real gift he left me, a sense of purpose and the determination to follow through when everyone else thought I'd fail. That night, the crickets outside sounded louder than usual, and the sky was studded with more stars than I'd ever seen back in suburbia. I heard the cows settle down in their pen, an oddly comforting sound. I wandered out to the barn, feeling the old wooden planks creak under my feet. It was like Grandpa's spirit was in every beam, every dust particle floating in the air. I leaned against a post, recalling all the times he'd given me little life lessons, often without saying much at all. Just the way he showed me how to be patient, how to care for the animals, and how to find peace in a simple routine. That's when I understood something crucial. My true inheritance wasn't just a physical land, but also Grandpa's unwavering belief in me. He'd seen potential in a kid who'd been brushed aside by his own parents. And now, I had a real chance to prove that his faith wasn't misplaced. The odds might have been stacked against me, but for the first time, I felt like I was steering my own ship. That's when it hit me. The journey was just beginning. I was standing at the edge of something new, something entirely my own. It wasn't going to be easy, especially since I knew zilch about running a farm by myself, but I had determination and a roof over my head, and that was more than enough to at least try. I took a final look at the silent fields, the moonlight grazing the tips of the grass, and breathed in a sense of possibility I'd never felt before. I guess it was time to see just how far I could go now that I was the one calling the shots. I woke up at dawn on my first official day as the sole occupant of my grandpa's farm, feeling an unfamiliar surge of independence. No one was around to bang on my bedroom door or tell me to hurry up. I set my alarm for 5 in the morning, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The early morning air outside felt crisp against my cheeks, and the sky glowed with pink and orange hues. It was a stark contrast to the city rush I'd grown up with, where the sound of garbage trucks and honking cars usually broke the silence. Here, roosters crowed in the distance, and a soft breeze rustled through fields of green. I started making a habit of going for a jog every morning, partly for exercise and partly to clear my head. The trails around the farmland offered a perfect view of rolling hills, scattered trees, and an occasional creek. The combination of solitude and fresh air did more for my nerves than any fancy therapy session ever could have. I felt a newfound appreciation for nature, noticing how the dew shimmered on blades of grass or how the sunrise seemed to paint the horizon a different color each day. Once I got back from my run, it was time for chores. I'd head over to the barn, where my small herd of cows waited with gentle impatience. They had learned that I was the one with the feed bucket and the milking pail, and they greeted me with low, drawn-out moos that sounded more affectionate than anything I'd ever heard back home. I had a rough idea of the routine from my summer spent with my grandpa, but there was no hiding the fact that I was still figuring things out. I'd fumble with the milking equipment at first, but at least the cows seemed patient, as if they understood I was doing my best. As I settled into farm life, I discovered an old notebook stuffed into one of my grandpa's worn-out toolboxes. The pages were filled with spidery handwriting that described a rustic cheese-making process he'd once shown me when I was a kid. He used to say there was an art to turning fresh milk into something special, and apparently he had documented every step. Excited by the memory, I decided I'd give it a try. It felt like one more way to keep his spirit alive on the farm. My first few attempts at cheese-making were, let's just say, they were far from legendary. The texture came out rubbery, and the flavor had me questioning if I'd messed up the temperatures or added the wrong amount of rennet. Still, I kept at it, learning from each batch and taking careful notes in the margins of my grandpa's old instructions. The barn cat occasionally wandered by to see if I dropped anything worth nibbling on, giving me a sideways glance when the smell got too strong. After a couple weeks of trial and error, I finally produced a batch that tasted just like I remember from childhood. Creamy, with a subtle tang that lingered pleasantly. The satisfaction I felt biting into that cheese was unlike any accolade I'd ever craved in the city. I could almost sense my grandpa's approval in the air, like he was there nodding at how I'd managed to replicate his closely guarded recipe. Before long, I started selling my cheese at a weekly farmer's market in a neighboring town. It was a modest market, but the locals were enthusiastic about anything homemade. I set up a small folding table, stacked with round waxy wheels I'd personally crafted and labeled. Folks would come by, sample a slice, and often end up asking if I had more stashed in my cooler. The money wasn't enormous, but it was decent enough to cover feed for the animals, some household necessities, and a bit extra for my savings jar. The bigger win was meeting a group of regulars who actually liked my product and asked when I'd be back next. That feeling of contributing something real and valuable to a community was a giant confidence boost. One morning, I pushed myself to run farther than usual. The weather was perfect, with a faint mist hanging over the fields. I found myself so entranced by the landscape that I barely noticed how far I'd gone until I came across another runner. It was surprising, since most people in the area seemed tied up with chores at that hour. We gave each other an awkward wave, then ended up running side by side for a while. She introduced herself as Emily, an 18-year-old who lived in the city but was staying with her parents, who owned a small farm a few miles away. She found it amusing to jog to the countryside, noticing how nobody else seemed to take time for exercise. I mentioned my own story, focusing on how I was newly settled on my grandpa's farm, trying to keep afloat. That was the start of an unexpected friendship. Emily and I ended up crossing paths on our runs frequently, and after a while, it turned into hanging out in the late evenings. She enjoyed cooking and often talked about how she hoped to open a little restaurant someday, one that served simple but forgotten dishes that reminded people of home. I shared my cheese-making journey, describing how I was trying to turn it into a real business, but had no clue where to find the funds for expansion. We bonded over these aspirations, sipping coffee under the stars next to a flickering porch light. Over the course of 2 years, life became both hectic and fulfilling. My cheese-making skills leveled up in ways I never anticipated. I started experimenting with different flavors, sometimes adding herbs or aging certain batches longer for sharper taste. Word spread around town, and I found myself juggling more orders than I could handle alone. Emily volunteered to help, mastering the art of packing and labeling the cheese wheels. We joked about how funny it was that we had stumbled upon each other in such a random corner of the countryside. In time, I realized my feelings for Emily went beyond casual friendship. The days felt incomplete without hearing her laugh, and even the cows seemed calmer when she was around. She became an integral part of my life, cooking hearty meals, sharing new recipe ideas, and encouraging me to keep pushing forward with my cheese-making dreams. Her parents, though not wealthy, were genuine in their support, occasionally stopping by the market stall to buy cheese for themselves and hand out business cards to friends. Eventually, I proposed, on a quiet evening with crickets chirping in the background, the moonlight illuminating the edges of the barn just right. Emily accepted, and it felt like a whole new chapter opened. She moved in, and the farm started to feel like it was ours rather than just mine. Her parents welcomed me as if I'd always been part of their family. And for the first time in years, I felt the warmth of people who genuinely cared. Meanwhile, my own family never bothered to reach out. I occasionally checked social media, catching glimpses of my sister's life in a high-end college setting. She posed for pictures in new outfits, seemed to have plenty of friends, and looked like she was living large. Part of me felt a pang of sadness, but it was overshadowed by the contentment of having found my own path and forming a new family with people who truly valued me. I still dreamed about taking my cheese business further, maybe constructing a dedicated cheese house or expanding into local stores. The thought of needing more funds loomed large, yet the weight of it felt lighter with Emily by my side. We had spent countless evenings talking about a shared future, blending her restaurant aspirations with my cheese making. Over time, I'd become convinced that together, we could create something special. Life on a farm was challenging, but it was also better than anything I'd known. I had love, support, and a growing enterprise. Each day brought fresh challenges and small triumphs, from perfecting a new cheese recipe to satisfying a sudden surge in customer orders. I felt unstoppable, buoyed by the memory of my grandpa's faith in me and the unwavering encouragement from Emily and her parents. I had come a long way from the forgotten kid I once was, and it seemed like the possibilities were endless. Still, every now and then, late at night, I'd find myself wondering how much further I could take this dream. The cheese-making business had potential, but it needed money to reach the next level. The thought gnawed at me even as I drifted off to sleep, imagining expansions and new markets. I knew I wasn't done yet. There was still so much to accomplish. Those questions and ambitions hovered in the back of my mind, setting the stage for whatever came next. I had a loving partner, newfound skills, and a supportive extended family. All that remained was figuring out how to turn our dreams into something bigger than either of us had dared to imagine. It was a perfect mixture of excitement and uncertainty, promising that the next chapter would be anything but dull. I was out near the cow pens one steamy afternoon, sweating through my t-shirt as I dug up fence posts that had rotted near the base. The plan was to swap them out with sturdy replacements, so our small herd wouldn't end up wandering off to the neighbor's soybean field. Not too long ago, a frisky calf nearly squeezed through a wobbly gap, and I figured if I didn't fix it soon, I'd be spending half my days trying to coax that calf back home. By the time I'd wrestled the new wooden post into place and packed each hole tight with dirt, I felt a weird combination of exhaustion and triumph, like I just conquered a particularly brutal gym session without air conditioning. I finally decided to call it quits and haul my tools over the shed, wiping a layer of sweat off my forehead every few steps. The shovel in my hand was thickly coated with mud, so I paused by the outdoor faucet to rinse it off. As I scraped away clumps of wet dirt with my glove, I noticed a bit of metal glinting near the edge of the blade. At first, I thought it was a squash bottle cap, but then I pried it loose, and my eyes landed on an old, tarnished coin. It had a dull brownish color and felt solid enough in my palm. Definitely not a cheap aluminum token or anything. I remember peering at the faint lettering and feeling a little rush of curiosity. Could be from decades ago, maybe centuries for all I knew. My fiancée, Emily, loves collecting odd little items. A pressed flower, a vintage postcard, even a chipped seashell if it has a cool pattern. I figured she'd get a kick out of this mysterious coin. I gave it a quick rinse to dislodge any clumps of dirt, marveled at how ancient it looked, then shrugged and slipped it into one of our kitchen drawers. I was too hungry and tired to examine it further. Cold lemonade was calling my name, and my arms felt like jelly after digging and hammering all afternoon. A couple of days drifted by with the usual farm chores, early morning milking, lugging feed sacks in the truck to barn, mending a broken door hinge here and there. I didn't give that coin a second thought. My mind was focused on making cheese orders on time and ensuring the cows didn't stage an escape. But one evening, Emily and I found ourselves sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through YouTube on our TV, enjoying that random playlist of recommended videos the algorithm conjures up. We'd turned it into a nightly ritual, letting the platform surprise us with everything from cooking hacks to deep-sea exploration clips. That night, we stumbled upon a video about people who struck it rich in unexpected ways. Folks finding a classic car in a rickety barn, or discovering a multi-million-dollar painting at a garage sale. We both got a kick out of it. I mean, in our day-to-day life, the closest we come to hidden treasure is when we find a fresh stack of cardboard boxes behind the hardware store that we can recycle for farm use. We saw a segment featuring someone who picked the right numbers on a lottery ticket they almost trashed, and another about an old family heirloom ring that turned out to be encrusted with genuine diamonds. Emily joked that we wouldn't mind a surprise fortune ourselves, especially with our grand plans. I'd love to upgrade my cheese-making facility so I can expand production, and she dreams of building a cozy, down-home restaurant that highlights local ingredients. I tease that luck never seemed to grace me, especially considering my childhood track record of being overshadowed by everyone else. But we laughed it off, acknowledging that those newsworthy miracles usually skip over regular folks like us. The video rolled on, morphing into a segment about rare coins, how some are minted with special errors or made in such limited numbers that collectors shell out astronomical sums. Emily perked up, while I mock-sighed about never finding anything more interesting than a battered quarter with a scuffed-up eagle design. And that's when it hit me. The coin I had fished out from the mud. I actually scrambled off the couch right then, rummaging through our cluttered kitchen drawers until I spotted the dull, tarnished coin. Emily raised an eyebrow, obviously puzzled. I explained how I'd stumbled across it while doing the fence repairs and promptly forgot all about it. The video had basically jogged my memory. We sat there under the warm glow of our kitchen light, squinting at every subtle marking on its surface, trying to decipher the faint text. Curiosity thoroughly piqued. We hopped onto my laptop and dived into a rabbit hole of collector forums and numismatic websites. We scrolled through endless pictures of coins that ranged from modestly rare to outright legendary. At one point, we stumbled on details about the 1794 flowing hair silver dollar, a coin minted in 1794 and 1795, widely recognized as one of the first official silver dollars produced by the United States. Its design was apparently influenced by the Spanish dollar, matching its size and weight, and historians estimate only 150 to 200 of these coins remain today. The initial face value was just $1, but these days it can fetch anywhere from $1,000 to an eye-popping $7.75 million, with some even selling for well over $8 million at auction. The more we read, the more goosebumps I got. Turns out the coin in our drawer bore an uncanny resemblance to one of these highly prized specimens. My jaw nearly hit the floor, while Emily squeaked in surprise. I felt a rush of adrenaline, followed by a wave of disbelief. It was like seeing a viral video of someone's improbable luck and suddenly realizing, wait, that might be us. Of course, there was every chance ours was just a lookalike or a decent fake. We told ourselves not to jump to conclusions. But that didn't stop us from staying up all night sifting through articles on professional coin grading, authenticating techniques, and the best ways to approach major auction houses. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, I was almost delirious, still wondering if we'd lost our minds. But a plan had formed. We needed an expert opinion, and we needed it from a place that dealt in this kind of high-stakes collectible. Heritage auctions in Dallas kept popping up in our searches, so we pinned our hopes on them. Emily insisted on traveling with me to keep both my sanity and the coin safe. The next day, we discreetly told her parents we'd be out of town for a few days. They assumed it was some kind of farm errand, maybe picking up new equipment or scouting another market to sell cheese. I felt a tad guilty about leaving in the dark, but we wanted to avoid raising any expectations or rumors until we had clarity. We also asked a neighbor and a local farmhand to watch the cows and make sure none of them got into trouble. I packed a small duffel bag with a couple changes of clothes, some snacks, and my phone charger, trying not to lose my nerve. That evening, as I walked around locking up the doors, I couldn't help thinking about all the changes this farm had gone through since I'd first inherited it. I'd gone from feeling like a nobody to building a life that finally made sense. Now here I was on the verge of possibly stumbling into a crazy windfall, a scenario I would have labeled impossible just a few weeks ago. My stomach was in knots, tore between excitement and dread. What if the coin was worthless and I had just got my hopes up for nothing? But what if it wasn't? Early the next morning, Emily and I carefully placed the coin in a protective case she'd found online, then tucked it into a padded pouch for extra security. We locked up the farmhouse, double-checking that the caretaker arrangement was set, feedings, milking schedule, the works, and then hopped into our old pickup truck. The drive to Dallas would be long, but there was no turning back. Our hearts drummed in sync, and I kept glancing at the coin case as if it might vanish into thin air. Emily was uncharacteristically quiet at first. Usually, she'd be making playful observations about the scenery or humming along to songs on the radio. But it felt like we were both in the middle of a waking dream, unsure whether it would turn into a fairy tale or a cautionary tale. The farmland gave way to highways, and the miles rolled past in a blur of roadside diners, gas stations, and billboards advertising everything from hot sauce to personal injury lawyers. I found myself obsessing over the condition of the coin. What if a small scratch cut its value in half? I also wondered if experts might dismiss us outright, because we were just a couple of small-timers with no background in high-end collectibles. At one point, we pulled into a convenience store to grab some beef jerky and energy drinks. Emily joked that if we really did strike it rich, we might come back and buy out the entire snack aisle. It was a silly thought, but it lightened the mood. Our conversation veered to daydreams about what we'd do if it all panned out. Maybe I'd get a high-tech cheese production setup, complete with climate-controlled aging rooms, and Emily could open a restaurant that served all sorts of classic farmhouse recipes with a gourmet twist. We'd pictured the menu featuring fresh cheese, homemade bread, and seasonal produce straight from local farms. Still, every time we let ourselves dream, a wave of caution pulled us back. We knew better than to assume it was a sure thing. Counting your chickens before they hatch is a surefire recipe for disappointment. Yet we couldn't quite tamp down the jittery excitement buzzing in our veins. It was like waiting for results on a lottery ticket. You only half believed might be the winner. By the time we reached the outskirts of town, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. I glanced at Emily, noticing her anxious smile. This could be the biggest turning point in our lives, or it could be a wild goose chase. Either way, it felt surreal to think we'd soon be walking into an auction house known for million-dollar sales, carrying a coin that was literally pulled out of a muddy hole on our farm. As we pressed on, we tried to reassure each other that, no matter the outcome, we'd still have our farm, our cheese business, and our shared dreams. The coin could be icing on the cake, or it might be a dud, but at least we were in it together, forging ahead with all the courage we could muster. By the time we passed a faded welcome sign on the edge of our small hometown, I could feel my heart pounding. I sent up a silent hope that we'd find clarity in Dallas, one way or another. Emily gave my shoulder a squeeze, and I knew she was feeling the same anticipation. We were about to find out if we'd stumbled into one of those mesmerizing YouTube-worthy tales ourselves, or if we'd be returning home with nothing but a well-worn story to tell. The truck's engine hummed, and the road stretched on, dotted with possibilities and uncertainties. In that moment, we both realized this journey might reshape our entire future, whether we ended up with fortune or just another lesson. And in that space between doubt and belief, we kept driving, determined to see how this unbelievable twist would play out. The next morning arrived with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Emily and I navigated the busy streets in Dallas, weaving through traffic as we tried to locate the tall skyscraper that housed the auction company's main office. We had spent the previous night with our hearts pounding, imagining every possible outcome, but neither of us felt fully prepared for the reality of walking into such a high-profile environment. The building itself glistened with reflective windows, and the lobby buzzed with people dressed in crisp suits, all discussing rarities and collectibles as if it were the most normal thing in the world. We approached the reception desk with a protective pouch in hand, feeling slightly out of place in our more casual attire. A courteous staff member ushered us down a polished corridor to a private consultation room, where an appraiser greeted us. He invited us to sit and gently requested the coin for evaluation. We watched as he carefully laid it under a bright examination lamp, scrutinizing every minuscule detail through a jeweler's loupe. That half hour felt like it stretched for an eternity, with Emily tapping her foot on the floor and me trying not to fidget. Eventually, the appraiser returned, wearing an expression that telegraphed both astonishment and delight. He explained that the piece in his hands was genuinely rare, referencing how most such coins would be found only in top-tier collections or museums. He discussed auction records, pointing out that if we chose to list it with them, it could potentially fetch somewhere in the realm of $7 to $8 million, assuming enough high-rolling bidders showed interest. Emily exhaled so sharply that she teared up, overwhelmed by the idea that something so improbable could happen to ordinary people like us. We spent the next hour signing documents, reading through disclaimers, and officially handing the coin over to the auction house for safekeeping until the big day. The staff recommended we return in 3 days, when a live event would take place in front of serious collectors. They mentioned how the item would be photographed, cataloged, and marketed to prospective bidders worldwide. My head spun with all the talk of wire transfers and bidding increments, but we nodded along, still feeling as if we had fallen into someone else's daydream. After leaving the building, we found a nearby hotel and booked a room, agreeing that there was no point in driving back home only to return again in 3 days. We spent that short wait exploring the city's attractions, strolling through busy sidewalks, sampling local restaurants, and occasionally marveling at the surreal situation we had landed in. Emily tried to keep me calm each time I started second-guessing whether we had done the right thing or worrying that the entire deal might collapse. Meanwhile, I reminded her that we had come this far and might as well trust the process. When auction day arrived, the tension in the air felt tangible. The staff at the auction house ushered us into a well-appointed office where we could watch the live bidding on a large screen. Our coin had been given a prime slot in the auction order, accompanied by a brief written history of the 1794 flowing hair design. We spotted a handful of collectors sitting in the main hall, along with phones set up for remote bids from international participants. Emily kept gripping my hands so tightly that I lost feeling in my fingers. I caught glimpses of the bidding status as it began to climb, jumping in increments that made my heart stutter. Within minutes, a final offer landed at $7.8 million from a collector who seemed determined to outlast everyone else. The auctioneer's hammer fell, and just like that, the coin was officially sold. Emily seemed momentarily speechless, blinking as though she needed to confirm what had just happened. Once it all sank in, we found ourselves hugging each other, practically shaking with both excitement and relief. We took a short moment to celebrate in a quiet hallway while staff congratulated us. The formalities involved more paperwork, identity confirmations, and bank details. We ended up with over $6 million net once the auction fees, taxes, and other costs were accounted for. Although that sum was still staggering, it sank in that it was time to manage it responsibly. We talked through a plan with a financial advisor right there at the auction house, who suggested opening a new account to handle the deposit. By the end of that day, the funds were safely parked, awaiting the next phase of our lives. Once we returned to the farm, the first people we told, beyond our tight circle of neighbors who would cover for us, were Emily's parents. They practically jumped for joy, embracing us and wishing us every success with our future projects. After a couple of months of feverish planning, we got married in a small but heartfelt ceremony by a lakeshore near the farm. Her parents were there, along with our closest friends and a few of the local folks who had become like extended family. The day felt like the perfect start to a brand new chapter. With the capital at our disposal, we wasted no time building a proper cheese-making facility. I hired a team of dedicated workers, most of whom were folks from around the county who had been looking for steady, well-paid jobs. Emily's father took charge of milk sourcing and supply, forging relationships with other local farmers to ensure our production never ran short of premium dairy. Over the next year, we created an entire brand, complete with packaging and logos, eventually opening small shops across the state. People took to our artisan cheeses quickly, and sales skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Emily realized her dream by establishing a modern restaurant in the very city where I once lived. She focused on old-school recipes passed down through family lines, jazzing them up with a contemporary twist. Customers flocked to sample dishes that felt nostalgic yet sophisticated, and local food critics raved about how the menu spotlighted farm-fresh ingredients. Before long, the place was on all the must-try lists, sometimes requiring reservations booked weeks in advance. One day, Emily and I stopped by the restaurant unannounced, wanted to check that everything was running smoothly. The staff greeted us warmly, used to our surprise visits. As we wandered near the dining area, I happened to notice a familiar set of faces at one of the corner tables. My parents and sister seemed to be out for a celebratory meal, though it wasn't clear what they were celebrating. I didn't see them at first, but I heard them because they were loudly complaining to an overwhelmed waitress, demanding to see a manager and acting as if they owned the place. They berated the server for perceived delay in bringing their food, rolling their eyes and raising their voices in a way that caused nearby diners to glance over with discomfort. My stomach clenched, recalling a lifetime of such behavior. I took a breath and approached, curious about how they would react. The moment my sister noticed me, she wore a smirk that suggested she believed I was still the same forgotten kid from all those years. I informed them that I had no interest in idle conversation, that the way they had treated the waitress was unacceptable, and that they were expected to leave. My parents insisted on speaking to the owner, making grand statements about escalating complaint. By then, everyone nearby was observing. I calmly mentioned that I was, in fact, the owner, and that they had 5 minutes to exit the building or security would escort them out. They stared at me, as if trying to figure out if I was serious. I had no intention of backing down. In the end, they filed out, muttering about how everything had turned upside down. I felt a passing twinge of guilt mixed with a sense of vindication, but Emily placed a hand on my arm, quietly proud of the line I had drawn. A year passed, bringing more success. Our cheese operation grew, and we opened additional restaurant locations in other cities, each one thriving under the same ethos of fresh, locally sourced cuisine. We bought a house near the coast, drawn by the allure of ocean views and the hope of raising a family close to the rhythms of nature. We soon discovered that we were expecting our first child, a development that filled our days with happiness and planning for the future. Then, out of nowhere, a message arrived from my parents. They wrote that my sister had been laid off during an economic downturn, and that the family was struggling to keep their heads above water. They wondered if I could offer some financial assistance, given the success I had achieved. I read their message, remembering how many years had gone by without so much as a phone call or a gesture of care from them. Emily asked if I would help. I simply set the phone aside, reflecting on the fact that my real family was the one standing beside me now, the one that had shared my life and supported every step I'd taken. Without sending any reply, I turned off the device and embraced Emily, knowing that the ties binding me to my old life had been severed long ago. All I needed was here in the home and family we had built. That realization carried me into the future with renewed confidence, certain that I had finally found not just success, but the genuine belonging I had sought my whole life.